Welcome to Lesson 3A. Our Lessons 3 and 4 are going to focus on populations, samples, complex numerical summaries, and probabilities of research studies. Go ahead and hit pause, answer questions 1 and 2, and then come right back. Looking at question 1, jot down some research studies that you have heard about. Consider advertising, television, radio, experiences in hospitals, experimental studies, but research studies that you have heard about. Jot those down. Recall the 3 polling groups that were in our preview. When a company such as Gallup conducts a presidential poll, approval poll, why don't they contact everybody in the country? And hopefully you wrote down something along the lines of, it would be impossible, it would be very expensive, and not everyone actually can vote because of age or immigration status or immigration or criminal status or various and sundry other reasons. Impossible might be the best word. On your Lesson 3A in-class student page, consider underlining the following thoughts. In this lesson, you will understand why sampling is necessary in a statistical study. Just like we can't poll everyone in the United States of America, we might need to consider a sample to still be able to get an idea of opinions. That limiting the characteristics of the sample also limits the conclusions. I've already mentioned for you to have a glossary or flashcards or a Google Docs, something where you're writing down words and thoughts, that if we limit the characteristics of a sample, it's going to limit our conclusions that we can draw about the population. So you're starting to hone in on words like sample and population. And then look at the next bullet. We're going to be able to explain the difference between a sample and population, and we're going to use characteristics of a study sample to describe the population. And finally, we want to analyze the conclusions of a study, and explain the limitations on these things called inferences that we're going to make about a population. Take time to read through this, underline and highlight where it talks about researchers conducting studies usually need to draw a sample from a population. When a question about a group for a study is designed, the population is sit here for a second, it's the entire group that they want to say something about. The sample is the smaller portion, the smaller group that is selected from the entire group that they want to study. It's a subset of the population. And then the data for the study is collected from the manageable group called a sample. They want us to conduct a research study in our class. We have an online class, so let's try this. They want to know the ratio of males to females in this class. To answer question number 3, I'm going to go ahead and start putting information here on number 4. Question 3 said, write a ratio of males to females. Let me double check. Males to females in this class. So in our class, I looked at the roster and we have about 10 males to about 26 females. Question 4 then says, do you think that this ratio is the same ratio in all classes across the entire campus? And we can reduce this number, dividing out a 2, we'll get 5 over 13 if we want to look at a smaller number. But what this is saying is in our class, we have 5 males and 13 females. And they're asking, do we think this is the same across all classes across the entire campus? Why or why not? This is a great time for you to hit pause and answer questions 4 and 5, and then we'll discuss those. In prior classes, when students have talked about this, when it says all, that's a little suspicious right there. And when it says entire, that's a little suspicious too. You have to look at the characteristics of our class. This is an online class. This is an online class at a community college. There are certain trends based on statistical studies that the populations are about like at our campus, back in fall of 2016, there were about 60% female to about 40% male. And I've got this upside down where we've got about 40 to about 60 based on what they were asking for question 3. We are usually smaller in our enrollments for males than we are for females. There are trends. There are, again, statistical studies. But when it asks us about all classes, we also have trends that some of our classes are traditionally more female or traditionally more male. So we cannot look at our class and say, oh yeah, our online class at a community college after a Hurricane Harvey, it's is going to be identical to all of the other campus or classes across our entire campus. That's my thought on why it is not, but you need to write down your opinions about why you think it is or why you think it also is not. In our study, this little study that we just did, looking at numbers, throwing in some past data, talking about characteristics, in our study about the male to female ratio, describe the population and sample. And these are words that you're going to need to wrestle with in your mind to get these to make sense. If we were in class together, I'd be waving my arms really big to be the population and then closing in my arms smaller to be the sample. The population is our entire campus. In this particular study, the population is the entire campus. The sample is our class. We are a part of this whole, and what we were attempting to do is if our class represents the entire campus, then we can do some surveys, some discussions, focus groups in our class, and then use another word called inference and say what we are like is what we can infer that the entire campus is like. But if we're not like the entire campus, our study is already looking a little faulty. Another word we need to write down is the word inference. Inference, gotta find my pen. Inference is the process of using data from a random, we're going to talk more about that through the lessons, sample to draw conclusions about a population, because we're not able to survey or question, get answers from an entire population. Although we cannot obtain the exact value of a measurement about a population from a sample, here are very important words. We can get close. And we're going to use statistical techniques to determine whether we should depend on those results that we get. So talking about our study, where we looked at that we have 10 males to 26 females in our classroom aboutish. So when we looked at this and I brought in some past data, I'm like, this is not close to what we've seen before on our entire campus. But what if we were looking at a different population? What if we were looking at the population of online students? Could we then say that our course is typical or that it represents the online course population at Lone Star College Kingwood? If that was the case, if our study then had a different population, the inference we would be trying to make is that ideas, thoughts, information that we could get from our class is close to the population that we have defined. And it is the concepts we're going to start looking at, we've got to think on, we've got to write about, we've got to discuss, and then especially right here where it starts talking about, are we going to be able to depend on our results? We'll talk about how we're setting up our studies, how to make them as clean and usable as we can. One word to keep in mind is inference. We're looking at our sample and what can we or can we not infer about a population or the population we're drawing the sample from. This is definitely a place where you want to click on pause and complete question 7. You might want to come back after 7 before going on to question 8, but both of these you need to spend some time in thought alone before listening to the video. Question 7 asks us to consider the following examples. Describe the population of each scenario from which the sample was drawn. Looking first at Part A. A random sample consists of 2,000 adults in Florida, and they were asked if they support legalization of marijuana for medical use. As you are looking at this, you're trying to think broad. The 2,000 adults are in Florida and they've been asked a question. But what are the 2,000 adults a sample of? I believe we can say they're a sample of all of the adults in Florida. The next question. We have another random sample. This time it's 1,250 registered voters in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They were asked if they approve a property tax increase to fund additional school maintenance. When you're looking at this sample, remember it is a sample of a larger population. We need to be specific, but not specific. We need to note that we have registered voters. There may be people eligible to vote, but we specifically are talking to those who are registered voters. And specifically, where are they? Are they the entire state of Michigan, or they're the ones who are in Grand Rapids, Michigan? Finally, the Nielsen Ratings Company selects 2,500 families from across the United States to participate in their television rating program. Wow, I've got this drawn up pretty rough looking there. And in this particular question, we notice Nielsen ratings, and you have to know that those are from television. And then we notice that they're selecting families, and we notice it's the United States. So this is definitely going to be TV viewers, and it's definitely going to be the United States. But when we've discussed this in my face-to-face classes, we go round and round about the family part. How are we defining a family? And I like it that my students are providing some good questions. What is a family? Is it a unit of one? Do we need it to be multiple, as in 2, 3, or 4 or more people? So it is enough to say it's the TV viewers in the United States, but in your opinion, if you want to include that it's a family or a family of or not individuals, the TV viewers in the United States captures it all, but you decide what argument or statement you want to make about what you really believe the population is. You might hit pause before doing question 8, because then it says in each of the examples, describe the inference that's going to be made about the population from this sample. If you haven't already hit pause, go ahead and do so and come back and we'll talk about how these, some answers for part 8 or question 8. An inference that we could make about the first sample. Remember, this sample includes the 2,000 adults in Florida. The population were the adults in Florida. And the inference we're trying to make from this sample is not anything about 2,000, but it's saying that whatever results we're getting from those 2,000, we are going to infer that the adults in Florida have these same opinions about legalizing marijuana use or marijuana for medical use. So a statement you can make is the percentage of adult Floridians who support medical marijuana legalization. Part B, we're not discussing these 1,250 registered voters. That was our sample. We now want to infer something about the percentages of what we just found out. And we would be inferring that the percentage of, here's our population, registered voters in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we would be stating something about, like right up here, what percentage approved a tax hike. Finally, looking at C, our sample included, or was, this 2,500 families. And what are we trying to say about these families? The Nielsen ratings look at what shows are preferred by the viewers. And so our inference would be, what are the television preferences, choices, leanings of the United States viewers? And again, if you want to see this differently to include families or define families, write C accordingly. This concludes our lesson 3A. You need to check your calendar to see if you have more lessons that are due this week.